What would you do if a skeletal figure stalked you through the forest, or if a sinister Wendigo hunted you after a ritual gone wrong? In today's chilling tales, we'll dive into 5 terrifying encounters that will leave you questioning the safety of the night. From creatures lurking in the trees to supernatural beings that shouldn't exist, each story will pull you deeper into the unknown. Which story will haunt you the most? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Stick with us till the end, this is going to be a wild ride. A terrifying light in the dark forest. It was a cool, still evening when Jonas and Peter decided to head into the woods behind their small village in northern England. Armed with flashlights and an old jar, they had one simple mission: catch frogs. It had become a tradition during the summer months, an adventure under the cover of night that always brought laughter and the thrill of the unknown. Their loyal companion, Rex, a large and brave German shepherd, trotted alongside them, his tail wagging, always eager to be part of their midnight escapades. The forest was dense, with tall trees that stretched toward the darkening sky. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting eerie patterns on the ground as they wandered deeper into the woods. The boys talked quietly, their voices mixing with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Rex moved ahead of them, his nose close to the ground, sniffing at every corner, as if he was on his own little adventure. Suddenly, Rex stopped in his tracks, his ears perked, his body rigid. Jonas and Peter froze as well, their flashlights pointed at the ground where the dog stood. The air had changed. The lively sounds of the forest had faded, replaced by a strange, unnatural silence. For a moment, the only thing Jonas could hear was the sound of his own breathing, shallow and quick. Peter looked at him, confusion and a hint of fear in his eyes. That's when they saw it. Just ahead, floating between the trees, was a faint blue light. It hovered several feet above the ground, glowing softly but unmistakably out of place in the darkness of the woods. The light pulsed gently, as if it were alive, its glow casting faint shadows around it. It wasn't like anything they had ever seen before. Rex, the brave dog who had faced down wild animals without hesitation, let out a low whine. His ears flattened against his head, and before Jonas or Peter could react, he turned and bolted, running in the direction they had come from. The sight of their fearless companion fleeing in terror sent a cold wave of fear through both boys. Rex had never run from anything. Panic gripped them as they realized they were alone. The blue light, still hovering, seemed to pulse faster, almost as if it had noticed them. Without thinking, Jonas grabbed Peter's arm, and they turned, running after Rex, their feet pounding against the dirt path. The trees seemed to close in around them as they ran, the beams from their flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. Behind them, something shifted. They couldn't hear much over the sound of their own frantic footsteps, but there was a presence, a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. It felt like something was watching them, something malevolent and unseen, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. As they ran, Jonas glanced back, but there was nothing, no blue light, no movement. Just the dark, empty forest stretching endlessly behind them. Yet, the feeling remained. Whatever they had encountered wasn't gone. It was following. Jonas and Peter sprinted through the forest, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The darkness seemed thicker now, as if the trees themselves were closing in around them, making every step feel heavier. The narrow beams of their flashlights flickered with each jarring movement, casting strange, jagged shadows on the ground. Their only goal was to catch up with Rex, who had disappeared into the woods without a trace. The silence that had fallen over the forest was unnatural, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and nocturnal creatures were gone, replaced by an eerie quiet that made every small noise stand out. But it wasn't just the silence that unnerved them. It was the distinct feeling that they weren't alone. Behind them, the sound of footsteps began to echo through the stillness. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from their own frantic movements. But soon, it became unmistakable, something was following them. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching over the dry leaves and twigs. Jonas didn't dare to turn around, the fear too overwhelming. He could feel it in the air, that presence, watching them, waiting. Peter, breathing hard beside him, suddenly stumbled, nearly falling. Jonas grabbed his arm, pulling him up as they continued to run, but the momentary stumble had slowed them down just enough to feel the dread creeping closer. The footsteps behind them seemed to grow louder, more urgent. Neither of them spoke, there was no need. They both knew what the other was feeling, the same cold terror that gripped them both. Up ahead, the faint outline of a clearing appeared, and Jonas could just make out the shape of Rex waiting for them. The dog, still panting heavily, stood at the edge of the open space, his eyes wide and alert, ears perked toward the woods behind the boys. It was as if Rex, too, knew something was coming, something dangerous. Jonas and Peter burst into the clearing, their feet skidding to a stop as they reached Rex. For a moment, the sense of relief washed over them. They had found the dog, and they were out of the thickest part of the woods. But that relief was short-lived. The footsteps had stopped. The forest behind them was silent once again, but the presence remained. They could feel it, whatever it was, lingering just out of sight, watching them from the shadows of the trees. Rex whined softly, his body tense, as if he was ready to bolt at any moment. Jonas and Peter exchanged a quick glance, both of them trying to catch their breath, their minds racing. The blue light they had seen, the eerie silence, the footsteps, they couldn't explain any of it. But they didn't need to. The terror they felt was real, and whatever had followed them was still there. The night seemed to grow colder, and the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves around them. Jonas glanced back toward the forest, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but beyond that, there was nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. Something was out there, lurking just beyond their reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jonas and Peter stood frozen in the clearing, their breaths shallow as they scanned the dark Treeline. The feeling of being watched had not faded. If anything, it had intensified. The air around them felt heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Rex stood beside them, his body tense, ears twitching at every small sound. The dog's usual confidence had vanished, replaced by the same fear that gripped the two friends. For a long moment, none of them moved. The wind had died down, leaving only the stillness of the forest behind them. The clearing, which had seemed like a refuge just moments before, now felt like a trap. The boys were exposed, vulnerable. Whatever was lurking in the woods could be anywhere, watching them from the shadows. Jonas tightened his grip on the flashlight, his fingers slick with sweat. He didn't want to look back at the forest, but he couldn't help himself. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned, his eyes searching the darkness. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But there was no sign of movement. Nothing to indicate that they were being followed. Yet the feeling remained, stronger than ever. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. Peter, still catching his breath, spoke softly, his voice barely audible above the pounding of their hearts. "We should go," he said, glancing nervously at Jonas. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Jonas nodded in agreement. There was no reason to stay here any longer. Whatever they had seen, whatever had followed them, it wasn't something they wanted to encounter again. Without another word, they turned and began to walk, moving quickly but carefully through the clearing. Rex stayed close, his body low to the ground, as if he was ready to run at the first sign of danger. The silence of the forest was oppressive, pressing in on them from all sides. Every step felt like a risk, every moment a chance for something to emerge from the shadows. As they neared the edge of the clearing, the footsteps returned. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound of crunching leaves and snapping twigs echoed through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Jonas and Peter froze in place, their hearts racing as they listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if whatever was following them was toying with them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jonas's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at Peter, whose face was pale with fear. Rex let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the dark Treeline behind them. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. The boys could feel it, a presence that seemed to seep into their bones, filling them with an overwhelming sense of dread. Without thinking, Jonas turned and ran, pulling Peter along with him. They sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, the sound of footsteps growing louder, faster, as if the unseen presence was chasing them down. The darkness closed in around them, the trees a blur as they ran, their only thought to escape whatever was following them. Jonas and Peter ran as fast as their legs would carry them, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest blurred around them, a dark mass of twisted trees and shifting shadows. Behind them, the sound of footsteps echoed louder, faster, matching their frantic pace. The presence, whatever it was, had begun its chase, closing in with every passing second. Rex darted ahead of them, his body low to the ground, his ears flat against his head. The once brave and fearless dog was now just as terrified as his companions, driven by the same primal instinct to escape. Jonas could barely think, his mind clouded by the overwhelming fear that coursed through him. All he knew was that they had to get out of the forest, away from whatever malevolent force was pursuing them. The boys stumbled over roots and rocks, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they ran. The light from their torches flickered, casting eerie shadows across the path, but they could barely see through the blur of trees. The footsteps behind them grew louder, heavier, as if the presence was gaining ground, drawing closer with each passing moment. Jonas dared a glance over his shoulder, his heart skipping a beat as he did. The trees stretched endlessly behind him, dark and silent, but there was no figure, no creature that he could see. Only the sound of footsteps, growing louder, echoing through the night. It was as though the presence was invisible, a force that existed just beyond the edge of sight, yet close enough to feel. Peter stumbled, nearly falling to the ground, but Jonas grabbed his arm, pulling him back up. They couldn't afford to slow down. The clearing was far behind them now, the safety of home still out of reach. The only sound in the night was their frantic breathing, the pounding of their feet, and the relentless footsteps chasing them. Rex barked sharply, a sound filled with panic and fear. The dog veered off the path, heading toward the edge of the forest where the trees began to thin out. Jonas and Peter followed without hesitation, their legs burning with exhaustion but fueled by the terror of whatever was behind them. The edge of the forest was close now, the faint glow of the village lights just visible through the trees. The footsteps behind them stopped. Jonas and Peter skidded to a halt at the edge of the woods, their chests heaving as they gasped for breath. The night was suddenly quiet again, the oppressive silence returning like a heavy blanket. They stood still, their bodies tense, listening for any sound, any sign that the presence was still there. But the footsteps were gone. Rex stood beside them, panting heavily, his ears still perked, his eyes fixed on the dark woods behind them. The boys exchanged a look, their faces pale, their bodies trembling with fear. They didn't speak, there was no need. The terror they had felt was all too real, and whatever had followed them had stopped just short of the village. As they stood there, staring into the darkness, they knew one thing for certain, whatever they had encountered in the forest that night wasn't gone. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance to strike. Face to face with a Bengal tiger. The Sundarbans, a sprawling mangrove forest in Bangladesh, was known for its beauty and danger in equal measure. For Jamal and his family, it was supposed to be an adventure, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to explore the wild and untamed nature of the park. Along with a group of other tourists, they set out early in the morning, guided by a local expert, Rahim, who knew the forest better than anyone. The dense mangrove trees surrounded them on all sides, their thick roots tangling in the muddy ground as the group walked cautiously along the narrow paths. Rahim led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Everyone knew the risks. The Sundarbans were home to some of the most fearsome predators on Earth, the Bengal tigers. Jamal, his wife Amina, and their 2 children, Zain and Farah, were thrilled by the adventure. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and mud, and the distant calls of birds echoed through the trees. Every step deeper into the forest felt like a step back in time, away from the modern world and into a place ruled by nature's oldest laws. As the group moved further into the jungle, the atmosphere shifted. The once lively chatter of the tourists quieted, replaced by the sounds of the forest. The occasional rustle of leaves or the soft splash of water kept them on edge, though they didn't know why. Rahim remained calm, his presence reassuring, though his focus never wavered. Without realizing it, Jamal and a few others had begun to fall behind. They were too busy taking pictures, pointing out the exotic plants and animals to their children, to notice how far they had drifted from the main group. Amina was the first to notice, glancing around and realizing that Rahim and the rest of the tourists were no longer in sight. "Jamal," she called out softly, concern creeping into her voice. He looked up from the trail, realizing they were alone, surrounded by the towering trees and thick underbrush. Farah clutched his hand, her eyes wide as she sensed her mother's worry. Before they could call out for Rahim, a sound cut through the silence, a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of Jamal's neck stand up. It was distant, but unmistakable. A tiger. Jamal's heart began to race, and without thinking, he grabbed his family's hands, pulling them closer. He scanned the dense foliage, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing but the shadows of the mangroves. Farah's voice trembled as she asked where the others were, but Jamal didn't answer. The growl had shaken him, a reminder of just how dangerous the Sundarbans could be. They needed to find Rahim and the rest of the group, and quickly. His hands trembled as they began to move back in the direction they thought the group had gone, but every step felt slower, heavier, as if the forest itself was watching them. And then, just ahead, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as the sound of the footsteps grew louder. The dense mangroves around them seemed to close in, their shadows growing longer as the sunlight filtered through the thick canopy above. Amina tightened her grip on Farah's hand, pulling her closer as Zayn stood frozen, wide-eyed with fear. There was no mistaking it now, they were not alone in the forest. The heavy footsteps were deliberate, each one slow and calculated, sending a chill down Jamal's spine. He knew enough about the Sundarbans to understand that the predator stalking them was no ordinary animal. Bengal tigers, known for their stealth, often moved silently through the forest, but this one seemed different. The tiger wanted them to know it was there, as if it was toying with them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jamal's mind raced. They were too far from Rahim and the other tourists. Without the guide's rifle and knowledge of the land, they were completely vulnerable. His only thought was to get his family to safety, but the direction of the footsteps made it clear, the tiger was between them and the rest of the group. Amina whispered her concern, her voice barely audible above the pounding of their hearts. She looked around, her eyes darting from one shadowy tree to the next, as if expecting the tiger to leap out at any moment. Jamal nodded grimly, knowing they had to move, but every direction seemed fraught with danger. The forest that had felt so alive and vibrant just moments ago now felt like a trap. The tiger's growl rumbled through the air again, this time much closer. Zayn gasped, clutching his father's arm, his small body trembling with fear. Jamal's instinct kicked in. He turned to Amina, his eyes filled with urgency, and motioned for them to move quietly. They couldn't outrun the tiger, but they could try to avoid provoking it further. Slow, deliberate steps, no sudden movements. The family began to inch forward, their bodies low to the ground, as if hoping to blend in with the thick underbrush. Each step was agonizing, the leaves crunching softly beneath their feet, the sound almost unbearable in the eerie silence. The presence of the tiger loomed over them, unseen but undeniably close. Jamal could feel it, its eyes, watching them, calculating its next move. Farah whimpered softly, and Amina placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, trying to soothe her without speaking. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every second felt like an eternity as they moved through the trees. The footsteps behind them had stopped, but the danger hadn't passed. The tiger was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. Just when Jamal thought they might have a chance, the forest exploded with a deafening roar. The sound was so close, so powerful, that it sent a wave of terror through all of them. Jamal spun around, his heart racing, and in the distance, just behind a cluster of trees, he saw it, an enormous Bengal tiger, its eyes gleaming in the dim light, no more than 10 meters away. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jamal locked eyes with the tiger, its massive body crouched low, muscles tense, ready to strike. The air was thick with fear, and all Jamal could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears. The tiger's yellow eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity, and Jamal knew in that instant they were too close, far too close. Instinctively, Jamal grabbed his children, pushing them behind him as if his presence alone could protect them. Amina stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror, clutching Farah's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The tiger let out another low growl, its body shifting ever so slightly, preparing to lunge. In the back of Jamal's mind, a single thought pulsed with urgency: they had to get back to Rahim. The guide was their only hope, his rifle the only thing that could stop the tiger from attacking. But Rahim was nowhere in sight, and the dense mangroves between them and the rest of the group felt like an impenetrable barrier. Running felt impossible, yet staying still was certain death. Without warning, the tiger took a step forward, its eyes never leaving Jamal and his family. The sheer power of the creature was overwhelming, its muscles rippling beneath its striped coat, every movement deliberate and deadly. Jamal felt his breath catch in his throat. They had to move, and they had to do it now. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jamal whispered a quick command to Amina and the children. They needed to move quietly, slowly, no sudden movements that might provoke the tiger. He glanced toward the direction of the group, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rahim, praying that the guide would realize they were in danger. But the forest remained silent, save for the low growl of the tiger and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Jamal and his family began to back away, their steps slow and careful, their eyes never leaving the tiger. The predator watched them closely, its tail twitching with anticipation. Every second felt like an eternity, and the distance between them and the tiger seemed impossibly small. Jamal's hands trembled, his palms slick with sweat, but he forced himself to stay calm, to keep moving. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Jamal's heart leapt in his chest as he realized it had come from Rahim. The tiger paused, its ears flicking back at the sound, and for the briefest moment, it hesitated. Jamal seized the opportunity, motioning for Amina and the children to run. They bolted through the mangroves, their feet slipping on the muddy ground, but they didn't stop. The forest came alive with noise, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the distant roar of the tiger. Behind them, they could hear Rahim shouting, calling out to them, but the fear of the tiger was too great. They ran faster, adrenaline surging through their bodies, desperate to reach safety. Jamal could feel the presence of the tiger behind them, even though he couldn't see it. Every step felt like a race against death. The sound of Rahim's gunshots still echoed through the forest as Jamal, Amina, and the children ran for their lives. The jungle seemed to blur around them, the dense mangroves and twisting roots a maze they could barely navigate. Fear drove them forward, their breaths coming in short, desperate gasps, the thought of the tiger chasing them never far from their minds. The tiger's roar had faded into the background, but its presence lingered, pressing down on them like a weight. Jamal's legs ached, each step through the thick mud more difficult than the last, but he didn't dare stop. His only focus was getting his family back to Rahim, the only person who could protect them from the beast lurking in the shadows. Every glance over his shoulder sent a fresh wave of panic through him, even though the tiger had yet to reappear. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, stalking them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The forest was alive with the sound of their escape, footsteps pounding against the earth, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Zayn and Farah, though terrified, ran as fast as their legs would carry them, keeping close to their parents. Amina's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she refused to let go of Farah's hand, pulling her along with determination fueled by pure survival. Ahead of them, Rahim's voice rang out again, this time closer. The guide had realized the danger and was coming for them. The sight of his figure emerging through the trees, rifle in hand, filled Jamal with a glimmer of hope. But they weren't safe yet. The tiger was still somewhere in the forest, and until they were back with the group, the danger remained. Rahim spotted them and waved them forward, his voice urgent as he called for them to hurry. Jamal, Amina, and the children pushed themselves harder, the distance between them and the guide shrinking with every step. The relief that washed over Jamal when they finally reached Rahim was overwhelming, but there was no time to rest. Rahim quickly positioned himself between the family and the direction from which they had come, his rifle raised and ready. For a long, tense moment, the forest was silent. The tiger's growls had stopped, and the jungle felt eerily still. Rahim scanned the trees, his eyes sharp, searching for any sign of movement. Jamal stood beside him, his heart still racing, but the terror that had gripped him began to ease now that Rahim was there. Then, without warning, the tiger appeared, its massive form stepping out from the cover of the trees, its yellow eyes fixed on the group. It was closer than they had realized, no more than 10 meters away. The tiger's muscles tensed, as if it were preparing to pounce, but Rahim didn't hesitate. He fired a second shot, the sound ringing through the forest like thunder. The tiger froze for a moment, its gaze locked on the group, before slowly retreating back into the jungle. It wasn't a full retreat, but the threat of the gunshot had stopped it from advancing further. The tension in the air was palpable, and the group didn't move until the tiger had disappeared completely from sight. Only then did Jamal allow himself to breathe, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his body. They had come dangerously close to disaster, but thanks to Rahim's quick actions, they had survived. The jungle, once filled with wonder and excitement, now felt like a place they would never forget. The forest laughter that won't stop. It was a quiet autumn afternoon when Lars and Jorn decided to take their usual walk through the dense forest near their village in northern Norway. Accompanied by Jorn's dog, Loki, a sturdy Norwegian elkhound, the two friends had made a habit of exploring the wilderness in their free time. The forest, with its towering trees and winding paths, had always been a place of peace and solitude for them. But that day, something felt different. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew still, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves fading away. Loki, who normally bounded ahead with excitement, stayed close to Jorn's side, his ears perked and his nose twitching nervously. Lars noticed it too, a strange, unsettling quiet that hung over the forest like a heavy fog. He exchanged a glance with Jorn, both of them feeling the same uneasy tension. They continued walking, but the sense of being watched crept over them. It was subtle at first, like a fleeting thought, but it grew stronger with every step. Lars glanced over his shoulder more than once, convinced that something was just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows. But every time he looked, there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of forest behind them. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees when it happened. A sound broke the eerie silence, a laugh, low and guttural, echoing through the forest. It was not a laugh of joy, but something darker, more sinister. Both friends stopped in their tracks, their blood running cold as the laugh seemed to come from all around them. Loki growled softly, his fur bristling as he looked toward the trees ahead. Lars felt his heart race, and Jorn's face had gone pale. They had walked these woods many times, but never had they encountered anything like this. Then, from the corner of his eye, Lars saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, too tall to be human, with wild red hair that seemed to glow in the fading light. The figure was wearing bright yellow clothing that stood out unnervingly against the backdrop of the dark forest. It didn't move, but it was watching them. They could feel its eyes on them, cold and unblinking. A shiver ran down Lars's spine as he whispered to Jorn, urging him to turn back. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable, and the strange figure only added to the growing sense of dread. Without another word, they turned and began walking quickly back the way they had come, Loki leading the way, his ears still alert. But even as they hurried through the woods, the laughter followed them, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. The figure remained at the edge of their vision, always there, watching, as if it were toying with them. And as they neared the edge of the forest, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It lingered, a haunting presence that clung to them, long after the figure had disappeared from sight. The next day, Lars and Jorn couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had followed them out of the forest. Loki had been restless all night, pacing back and forth, his eyes constantly darting toward the windows. Lars had hardly slept, his mind replaying the events of the previous day, the strange laughter, the unsettling figure with red hair, and the feeling of being watched. It all felt too real to be dismissed as a trick of the light or a mere coincidence. Jorn had tried to rationalize it, telling Lars that it was probably just a local playing a prank or someone lost in the woods. But deep down, both of them knew it was something more. There was a darkness in that forest, something that didn't belong, and it had found them. Despite their unease, they decided to return to the woods. It was part of their routine, after all, and they didn't want to let fear take control. This time, they chose a different path, one that led further away from the spot where they had first seen the figure. The day was brighter, the sun filtering through the trees, casting warm patches of light on the forest floor. It felt safer in the daylight, less intimidating. Loki seemed more at ease too, trotting ahead with his usual enthusiasm. For a while, it felt like a normal hike, the familiar sounds of the forest returning. The tension in their shoulders began to ease, and the two friends even started to joke about how spooked they had been the previous day. It all seemed so ridiculous now, in the bright light of day. But then, as they reached a small clearing, that feeling returned. Lars was the first to notice it, a shift in the air, as if the forest had suddenly grown still, the sounds of nature muted once more. His heart sank as the same sense of being watched crept over him, stronger than before. He glanced at Jorn, who had also stopped, his face tense. Loki, who had been sniffing around the clearing, suddenly froze, his ears perked up, his body rigid. And then, they heard it again, the same haunting laughter, echoing through the trees. It was unmistakable, the same low, guttural sound that had sent shivers down their spines the day before. But this time, it was closer, clearer, as if the source of the laughter was just beyond the trees. Lars felt his pulse quicken, and his eyes scanned the woods, searching for any sign of movement. And there it was. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just as before, tall and unnaturally still, with bright red hair and yellow clothing that seemed to glow in the dim light. Its face was hidden in shadow, but they could feel its gaze, fixed on them with an intensity that made their skin crawl. It didn't move, but the laughter continued, a sound that felt like it was wrapping around them, suffocating them in fear. Without a word, Lars and Jorn turned and ran. Loki barked, running alongside them, but the laughter followed, just as it had the day before, echoing through the forest like a twisted game. And once again, the figure stayed just out of reach, watching, waiting. The next few days were filled with an uneasy silence. Neither Lars nor Jorn spoke much about what had happened, but the fear lingered. Loki, once full of energy, seemed different too, quieter, more watchful. Every now and then, the dog would sit by the door, ears perked, as if listening for something that only he could hear. Lars felt it too, that sense of being watched. It had followed them home, an invisible presence that clung to their every move. Despite their fear, they decided to try again. They couldn't explain why, but something drew them back to the forest, as if the mystery of the figure and the laughter demanded answers. This time, they chose a completely different trail, far from the previous paths, hoping the distance would make a difference. The forest was quiet when they entered, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their boots. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. For the first time in days, Lars felt a sense of calm. It was easy to believe that whatever had happened before was behind them, that it had been nothing more than a strange, unexplainable occurrence. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar tension returned. The air grew heavier, the sounds of the forest fading once more. Lars glanced at Jorn, and he knew that his friend felt it too, the same eerie stillness, the same invisible eyes watching them from the shadows. Loki, who had been walking ahead, suddenly stopped. His ears twitched, his body tense. Lars' heart sank as the realization hit him, they were not alone. He could feel it, that same oppressive presence that had haunted them before. It was here, following them, just as it had before. The laughter came again. It was faint at first, a distant echo carried on the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct with each passing moment. Lars' breath caught in his throat as the sound wrapped around them, filling the forest with its sinister tone. It was the same low, guttural laugh that had sent them running before, but this time, it felt closer, too close. Lars turned, his eyes scanning the trees, and there it was. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching them with the same eerie stillness. Its bright red hair and yellow clothes seemed out of place in the dark forest, almost glowing in the fading light. But it wasn't the sight of the figure that terrified Lars the most, it was the way it seemed to follow them, no matter where they went, no matter how far they tried to run. Jorn grabbed Lars' arm, his face pale with fear. They had to leave. The figure hadn't moved, but the sense of dread was overwhelming, pressing down on them like a weight. Without a word, they turned and began walking quickly back toward the village, Loki close by their side. But even as they hurried through the trees, the laughter followed them, growing fainter but never fading completely. The figure had found them again. Lars and Jorn didn't speak as they hurried back toward the village, their footsteps quick and uneven on the forest floor. The oppressive feeling of being watched grew with every step, wrapping around them like an invisible shroud. Loki, usually brave and adventurous, stayed close, his ears flat against his head, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The familiar path back to the village seemed longer than usual, as if the forest itself was stretching out, trying to keep them inside. Lars couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast they moved, they wouldn't be able to escape. Every now and then, Lars glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure lurking just behind them. But there was nothing, only the darkening forest and the occasional rustle of leaves. Yet, the presence remained, heavy and suffocating. It was as if the figure had become part of the forest itself, watching them from every shadow, every dark corner. Jorn broke the silence with a hushed voice, suggesting that they should take a different route back, hoping it would throw off whatever had been following them. Lars nodded, though he wasn't sure it would make any difference. The figure had found them twice already, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it would find them again, no matter where they went. They veered off the main path, taking a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the last rays of sunlight barely piercing the thick canopy above. Lars' heartbeat quickened, his skin prickling with the sensation that something was right behind them, just out of sight. Then, they heard it. The laughter returned, echoing through the forest, low and guttural, the same sinister sound that had haunted them since their first encounter. It was closer this time, louder, as if the figure was right on their heels. Lars felt his blood run cold. They were being hunted. Panic set in. Without thinking, they broke into a run, Loki leading the way, his paws pounding against the earth. The trees blurred around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to pull them back. The laughter followed, growing more distant but never disappearing completely. Lars didn't dare look back. All he could think about was getting out of the forest, away from the figure, away from the laughter that seemed to taunt them with every step. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept running, fueled by pure terror. Finally, the trees began to thin, and the familiar sight of the village appeared through the gaps in the branches. Relief washed over Lars as they burst out of the forest, their feet hitting the gravel road that led back to safety. The laughter stopped. The oppressive feeling lifted. But as they slowed to a stop, gasping for breath, Lars couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The figure had followed them before, and he knew, deep down, that it would follow them again. The forest was no longer just a place of adventure. It was a place of fear. Summoning the Wendigo, a deadly mistake. The sun was sinking behind the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Mountains when Michael and Caleb found themselves deep in the forest, far from the safety of their small town. The air was cold and still, the thick pine trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Michael, always the more adventurous of the two, had suggested the trip. He had heard about a ritual, something old, something dangerous, that supposedly summoned a Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore. Caleb had laughed it off at first, but here they were, standing in a clearing miles away from any sign of civilization. Michael grinned as he turned to Caleb, his voice low as he explained the details of the ritual. The Wendigo was a spirit, a creature of hunger and madness, known for its insatiable appetite for human flesh. According to legend, it could be summoned by saying its name aloud 3 times in the right place, in the right way. Caleb rolled his eyes, but there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. They had gone too far to turn back now. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. Michael took a deep breath and, with a dramatic flair, began to say the name. Wendigo. Caleb crossed his arms, watching with a smirk as Michael continued. Wendigo. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up slightly, though neither of them said anything. Michael hesitated for just a moment before saying the name a final time. Wendigo. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind died down, the forest remained still, and Caleb let out a short laugh, shaking his head. But just as he opened his mouth to mock Michael, there was a sudden creaking sound from behind them, loud and ominous, like the groan of old wood under pressure. They turned just in time to see a massive pine tree swaying unnaturally, its thick trunk bending as if pushed by an invisible force. Before either of them could react, the tree came crashing down, missing them by mere inches. The impact shook the ground beneath their feet, sending a cloud of dust and pine needles into the air. Michael and Caleb stumbled backward, their hearts racing, adrenaline surging through their veins. They stared at the fallen tree, disbelief etched on their faces. It had come so close, too close. Caleb's smirk was long gone, replaced by wide-eyed fear. Michael, too, looked shaken, his bravado slipping away as the reality of the situation set in. Without speaking, they both turned to leave the clearing, their minds racing. But as they began to walk away, something stopped them in their tracks, a voice. It was soft, almost familiar, calling Caleb's name from deep within the forest. Caleb froze, his blood turning to ice. He knew that voice, but something about it was wrong. Michael grabbed his arm, shaking his head, his expression grim. They both knew the stories: when something calls your name in the woods, you don't answer. But the voice called again, this time louder, more insistent. And then, from the shadows, they saw it. The air around them seemed to grow colder as Michael and Caleb stood frozen, staring into the dark forest. The voice had called Caleb's name again, but neither of them dared to respond. It was too familiar, too human, but they knew better. They had both grown up with stories about the forest, about things that mimicked voices to lure people in. Whatever was calling them, it wasn't someone they knew. The trees ahead of them rustled, and then, through the thick shadows, they saw movement. At first, it was just a flicker, like something shifting between the trees, too fast to make out clearly. But then it stepped into the dim light filtering through the branches, and Caleb felt his heart stop. The creature that stood before them was massive, far larger than any animal they had ever seen. It stood on 2 legs, its body gaunt and twisted, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Long, spindly limbs hung at its sides, ending in claws that looked sharp enough to tear through flesh with ease. But it was the creature's face, or what passed for a face, that sent a wave of pure terror through them. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. But what was most disturbing was that it almost looked like it had once been human. There were remnants of something familiar in its shape, something grotesquely human-like. A Wendigo. Caleb's breath came in short gasps, his legs trembling beneath him. Michael stood beside him, equally paralyzed by fear, his face pale in the fading light. They had come out here, joking about a ritual, but now the reality of what they had summoned was standing right in front of them. The Wendigo took a slow step forward, its long limbs moving unnaturally, as if it was getting used to its own body. It was tall, towering over them, its shadow stretching across the forest floor. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the trees. Michael and Caleb knew they couldn't outrun it, Not here, not in this thick forest. But they had no other choice. Without a word, Michael grabbed Caleb's arm, yanking him back toward the path they had come from. They turned and ran, their feet pounding against the ground, slipping over rocks and roots in their frantic escape. Behind them, they could hear the heavy footsteps of the Wendigo, each one closer than the last. Branches whipped past their faces, and the trees seemed to close in around them, making it harder to see the path. But they couldn't stop. The sound of the creature's growls grew louder, filling the air with a sense of dread that made it hard to think straight. Every instinct screamed at them to keep running, to not look back. Caleb risked a glance over his shoulder, and what he saw nearly made him stumble. The Wendigo was gaining on them, its long arms reaching out as it moved with terrifying speed. Its eyes, those dark, empty pits, were locked on him. And as they ran, the voice came again, more insistent, calling his name. This time, it was closer, almost right behind him. But Caleb knew better than to answer. He knew the creature was trying to trick him. But how long could they run before it caught them? The forest seemed to twist and warp around them as Michael and Caleb ran, their lungs burning with the effort. The Wendigo's footsteps thundered behind them, a constant reminder of the nightmare they had unleashed. Every few moments, they could hear the creature's guttural growls, each one sending a jolt of terror through their bodies. The trees were closing in, their branches grabbing at their clothes like claws, as if the forest itself was working against them. Caleb's mind raced. He couldn't shake the sound of the voice that had called his name, that familiar yet wrong sound. It had been so close, so real, and yet he knew it was a trick. The Wendigo was trying to lure them into stopping, into turning around, but they couldn't afford to fall for its trap. It was relentless, and its hunger was palpable in the air around them. Michael led the way, his flashlight bobbing up and down as he navigated the dark, uneven path. But it was hard to see, the thick underbrush making every step dangerous. Caleb stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but Michael grabbed his arm just in time, pulling him back to his feet. The two of them kept moving, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, the Wendigo's presence never far behind. The trees thinned slightly, revealing a steep hill ahead. Michael glanced back at Caleb, a look of desperation in his eyes. They had no choice but to climb, it was their only hope of putting distance between them and the creature. With no time to hesitate, they scrambled up the hill, their hands and feet digging into the dirt as they pulled themselves higher. Behind them, the Wendigo let out a furious roar, a sound that reverberated through the forest like thunder. It was growing impatient, its hunger driving it forward. Caleb risked another glance back and immediately regretted it. The creature was at the base of the hill, moving with an unnatural speed, its long arms reaching out toward them as it climbed. They reached the top of the hill, their bodies aching, but there was no time to rest. The Wendigo was closing in, and the only thing that mattered now was survival. The terrain at the top was more open, the trees spaced farther apart, but that also meant there was less cover. They could see the stars above them, the sky a dark, endless expanse, but it offered no comfort. Michael turned to Caleb, his voice breathless, urging him to keep moving. The Wendigo's footsteps were louder now, its massive form crashing through the trees below. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run faster, to keep going, but his legs felt heavy, his energy fading. The ground beneath them shook as the creature's roar filled the air once more, the sound so close it felt like it was right on top of them. Caleb knew they couldn't outrun it much longer. He could feel the Wendigo's presence, a dark, malevolent force that pressed down on them like a weight. And then, just ahead, they saw it, an old, abandoned cabin, half hidden among the trees. It was their only chance. The sight of the cabin ahead filled Michael and Caleb with a desperate hope. It was old, barely standing, with its wooden walls cracked and weathered by years of neglect, but it was the only shelter in sight. The Wendigo's roars echoed behind them, growing louder with every step they took. The creature was close, too close. With their legs burning and lungs screaming for air, they sprinted toward the cabin, the weight of the creature's presence bearing down on them. Loki, the loyal dog who had been with them through it all, darted ahead, sensing the urgency of the situation. The three of them reached the door in a rush, slamming it open and stumbling inside, their bodies colliding with the wooden floor as they gasped for breath. For a brief moment, there was silence. Michael and Caleb lay on the ground, staring at each other, their minds racing to process what had just happened. They had made it. But as they looked around the small, dimly lit interior of the cabin, the realization sank in: the door wouldn't hold for long. The Wendigo was still outside, and it would find a way in. Michael scrambled to his feet, searching the cabin for anything they could use to fortify the door. There wasn't much: an old, broken chair, a few rotting pieces of wood, and a dusty table that looked like it would fall apart if touched. Caleb helped as best as he could, his hands trembling as they pushed the table against the door, hoping it would buy them some time. But then they heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just outside the cabin. The walls creaked as the Wendigo moved closer, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Caleb could hear the creature's breathing now, a ragged, hungry sound that sent a shiver down his spine. The cabin felt small, like a cage, and the air inside was thick with the scent of decay. The door rattled as the creature tested it, and Loki barked, his body tense, ready to defend his friends. Michael grabbed a piece of wood, gripping it tightly as if it could somehow protect them from the thing outside. Caleb stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears, knowing that they were moments away from facing the Wendigo once again. Suddenly, the door splintered as the Wendigo slammed into it with terrifying force. The table they had pushed against it shifted, and the wood groaned under the weight of the creature. Michael shouted for Caleb to grab something else to block the door, but they both knew it was a losing battle. The Wendigo was too strong, too relentless. With a deafening crash, the door burst open. The Wendigo stood in the doorway, its massive frame silhouetted by the moonlight. Its hollow eyes locked onto them, and a chilling silence fell over the cabin. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a sudden, animalistic speed, the creature lunged forward. Loki barked furiously, leaping at the Wendigo, but the creature swatted him aside with one massive hand. Michael swung the piece of wood at the Wendigo, but it barely slowed the creature down. Caleb's mind raced. There had to be a way out, some last chance of survival. And then, in a moment of pure instinct, Caleb grabbed the flashlight from the floor and shone it directly into the Wendigo's hollow eyes. The creature let out a shriek of pain, its hands clawing at its face as it stumbled back. Taking advantage of the moment, Michael and Caleb rushed past it, grabbing Loki and running into the night. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest, the Wendigo's roars fading behind them. They had escaped, for now. Chased by the grinning man in the forest. It was a quiet night in the small village of Tórshavn, nestled in the Faroe Islands. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the distant crashing of waves against the rocky cliffs. Magnus had always enjoyed walking at night. The isolation gave him time to think, to clear his mind after long days working at the docks. The air was crisp, the faint scent of salt water lingering in the breeze as he made his way down the familiar path toward the edge of the forest. The forest loomed ahead, dark and dense, with towering pines that swayed gently in the wind. It was a place Magnus had walked through countless times without ever feeling fear. Tonight, though, something felt different. The shadows seemed darker, thicker, and the usual peaceful quiet felt oppressive, as if the trees were hiding something just out of sight. Magnus shook the feeling off, telling himself it was just his imagination. After all, he had walked this path hundreds of times before. But as he continued, a strange sensation crept over him, an unsettling awareness that he was not alone. He stopped for a moment, glancing around, but there was nothing. Just the trees, swaying in the breeze. He took a deep breath and resumed his walk, though now his steps were slower, more cautious. As he moved deeper into the forest, the feeling grew stronger. His skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Someone, or something, was watching him. He could feel it. Magnus quickened his pace, his heart beating faster as he scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. But the forest remained still, as if holding its breath. Then, he heard it, a soft rustling, like the sound of leaves brushing together. It was faint but unmistakable, and it came from above. Slowly, Magnus lifted his eyes to the treetops, his heart pounding in his chest. That's when he saw it. High up in one of the tall pines, a figure was crouched on a branch. At first, Magnus thought it was some kind of animal, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized it was a man. Pale and skeletal, the man's skin was stretched tight over his bones, his limbs impossibly long and thin. His eyes, sunken and hollow, stared down at Magnus with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The figure didn't move at first, just clung to the tree as if waiting. Magnus stood frozen, unable to look away. The man's face was twisted into an unnatural expression, a grin that seemed too wide, too knowing. And then, slowly, the figure shifted, its bony fingers gripping the branch tighter as if preparing to jump. Magnus felt a surge of panic rise within him. His legs itched to run, but his body wouldn't move. He could only watch as the figure began to lean forward, its eyes still locked onto his, that same eerie grin never fading. The moment the figure moved, Magnus knew he had to run. Magnus' heart raced as he stood frozen, his eyes locked on the skeletal figure clinging to the tall pine tree. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure, pale and twisted, seemed to relish the fear it was causing. It clung to the branch with an unnatural stillness, its hollow eyes fixed on Magnus, and that grin, a grin that made his blood turn cold, seemed to stretch even wider. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It leapt from the tree with an eerie, unnatural grace, its long, bony limbs reaching out as it descended. The sight snapped Magnus out of his paralysis. Pure adrenaline surged through him as he turned on his heel and sprinted down the path. The forest blurred around him, his feet pounding against the dirt trail as his breath came in ragged gasps. Every beat of his heart echoed in his ears, and all he could think about was getting as far away from that thing as possible. Behind him, Magnus heard the sound of something crashing through the branches, fast, deliberate, like a predator chasing its prey. He didn't dare look back. He knew it was the figure, and the thought of seeing it gaining on him sent waves of panic through his body. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing in around him, their branches reaching out like claws. The path, once so familiar, felt foreign and endless, as if the forest itself was changing, trapping him in its depths. Magnus ran faster, his legs burning with the effort, but no matter how far he went, he could still feel it behind him. The presence was constant, growing stronger with every step. His lungs burned, each breath becoming more difficult to draw. Sweat trickled down his face, mixing with the cold air, but he couldn't stop. The rustling behind him grew louder, closer, as if the figure was only steps away. Magnus' mind raced, he had to find a way out. He had to escape. Just when he thought he couldn't run any farther, he spotted a faint opening between the trees up ahead. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was his only chance. Without thinking, Magnus veered off the path, crashing through the underbrush, branches scratching at his face and arms as he pushed through the thick forest. He didn't care. He just needed to get away. As he ran, the forest grew denser, the trees closer together, making it harder to move. The sound of footsteps, or whatever it was, grew more distant, but he could still feel it, still sense the figure behind him, watching, waiting. Finally, Magnus burst through the last line of trees, stumbling into a small clearing. He collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. For a moment, the forest was silent, the only sound the harsh rasp of his breathing. But he knew it wasn't over. The figure was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and it wasn't finished with him. Magnus sat in the clearing, his body trembling with exhaustion, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, replaying the moment the skeletal figure had leapt from the tree, its pale, bony limbs reaching toward him like the grasp of death itself. The memory alone made his heart pound harder, but the silence that now enveloped the forest was even worse. He had escaped, for the moment, but the oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't left him. The creature was still out there, hidden somewhere in the dense shadows of the forest. Magnus knew better than to relax. The moment he let his guard down, the figure would return. The clearing around him felt small, as if the trees were closing in, their branches casting long, twisted shadows in the faint moonlight. Magnus scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The forest was too quiet, unnaturally so, and every nerve in his body screamed that something was about to happen. His pulse quickened as his eyes flicked from one dark corner to the next, but all he saw were the silent, towering pines. And then he heard it. A soft rustle, so faint that at first, Magnus thought it was just the wind. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. It came from the trees behind him, the same direction he had fled from. Slowly, Magnus turned, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. It was closer now, standing in the open, its hollow eyes fixed on him with an unblinking stare. The man's pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight, stretched impossibly tight over its bones. Its grin was still there, wide and unnatural, as if mocking Magnus' attempt to escape. Magnus' body went rigid with fear. He didn't dare move, afraid that any sudden motion would trigger the figure to attack. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but the forest surrounded him on all sides, and the creature blocked the only clear path. It stood perfectly still, its thin limbs hanging at awkward angles, waiting. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Magnus' thoughts were a blur of panic, but somewhere in the chaos, a single thought surfaced: he couldn't outrun it. He had already tried, and the figure had found him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how deep into the forest he went, the creature would follow. Magnus' eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything he could use to defend himself, but there was nothing. Just dirt, rocks, and the looming trees. His only option was to face it, though he had no idea how. The figure took a step forward. Magnus' breath caught in his throat as he watched the creature move, its limbs bending and contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The figure's grin widened, and it took another step, its hollow eyes never leaving Magnus. This was it. The moment he had feared. The creature was coming for him. Magnus' heart raced as the skeletal figure stepped closer, its twisted limbs moving with an unnatural fluidity. The grin on its face seemed to stretch even wider, a grotesque mockery of human expression. Every instinct in Magnus screamed for him to run, but he knew it was pointless. He had already tried that, and the creature had caught up with him. There was no outrunning it. The figure moved again, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. It took another step into the clearing, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows across its thin, bony frame. Magnus' body trembled with fear, his legs frozen in place as his mind raced for a solution, a way out. Suddenly, the figure lunged. Without thinking, Magnus threw himself to the side, barely dodging the creature as it crashed into the spot where he had just been standing. The impact sent a cloud of dust and dirt into the air, and for a split second, Magnus saw his chance. He scrambled to his feet, his muscles burning from exhaustion, and ran toward the edge of the clearing, his breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. The creature was right behind him. Magnus could hear it, the sound of its long limbs crashing through the underbrush, the heavy rustle of leaves as it pursued him. His mind was a blur of panic, every part of him focused on one thing: escaping. The forest seemed to blur around him as he ran, his feet slipping on the uneven ground, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Branches whipped at his face and arms, the sting barely registering through the adrenaline that pumped through his veins. The moonlight flickered through the trees, casting fleeting patches of light on the path ahead, but the forest felt endless. Magnus didn't know where he was running, only that he needed to get as far away from the creature as possible. Behind him, the sound of the figure's pursuit grew louder, more frantic. It was faster than before, more determined, and Magnus could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on him. The terror was overwhelming, but he pushed through it, his legs moving on pure instinct. And then, just as he thought the creature would catch him, Magnus saw it, an opening in the trees. It was small, barely visible through the dense foliage, but it was his only hope. He veered toward it, his heart pounding in his chest as he pushed through the final barrier of branches. He stumbled out into an open field. For a moment, Magnus stood there, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion. The forest loomed behind him, dark and ominous, but the creature was nowhere in sight. The field stretched out before him, bathed in the pale light of the moon, and for the first time that night, Magnus felt a glimmer of hope. But he didn't wait to see if the figure would follow. Without looking back, he sprinted across the field, his footsteps pounding against the soft grass. The open space gave him a sense of freedom, and the terror that had gripped him in the forest began to fade. When he finally reached the edge of the village, he slowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Magnus glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows, but the trees were still. The creature was gone. But the memory of its hollow eyes and twisted grin would haunt him forever. And now, we're left wondering, what other horrors might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike? From the skeletal figure in the trees to the Wendigo's relentless pursuit, these stories show us that the unknown is closer than we think. But which one chilled you the most? Do you have your own terrifying encounter to share with us? Let us know in the comments. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. And if you're ready for more spine-tingling stories, check out the other videos waiting for you right here on the channel. Thanks for watching, and remember, the next scare could be just around the corner.